Okay, so this is going to be our lecture on angular modularity, where we're going to be introducing you to what would be considered factories or services, and we'll talk a little bit about how that need arises. And after I end up going through the slides, which I'll make available to you, the next thing that we'll end up doing is I'll in a separate video. I'll show you sort of a simple setup of using factories, and so you get a better idea before we go into the next workshop where you'll be creating some factories. So, at this point we have this pattern where we have this client application, which is going back and forth and getting additional data from the server. But the whole nature of this is that we're sort of dealing with a single page application, where the client is staying in the browser and it's just really grabbing from the server, updating things, as needed. So there's really a big need to create things in a modular way. We've seen this where, we could end up creating in the case of our trip planner, where we saw even just sort of moving things from a couple of lists into this sort of destination panel. You could see that it was very, very easy for code to spiral out of the way. And you could end up coming up with, different ways to satisfy the problem and to make it more maintainable. But again, there was a big effort there really has to be a big effort on the developer's part in order to do that. Now, Angular ends up, solving a lot of these problems. You could sort of imagine if you had, an application can sort of be made up of, any number of different entities. So, I mean, maybe you have an application, and again, I think these are things that are on Facebook, where, you could have a news feed, you have the ability to do likes and comments, all these different pieces of this single page application. And so you could have a scenario where you're looking at a home page and you have this news feed, you have messaging, you have this trending list, or you could, have three other different panels that you're dealing with under sort of a messaging part of the application. And, maybe there's another section of the application which is going to, deal with private messages. And again, there can be different things that you'll be doing in this application. Maybe there's this part of the application. Maybe there's a section for uploading pictures, or for choosing emoticons, or for message display. And what it ends up coming down to is that you want to be able to sort of separate things out into smaller pieces. So things can get a little bit out of control during the development process. And really what you want to try to do is that as you're building things, you want to be able to separate out functionality. What it really ends up coming down to is that maybe we would end up considering a module or a block of code should be responsible for one thing. So where, when we end up looking at our controllers, we really, in the end, we don't want our controllers to end up doing too much. In our case, when we, started looking at Juke in the first workshop, we were making HTTP calls, we were doing other type of logic within our album controller. And really, the album controller is doing way too much. What we really want to be able to do is separate things out. So sort of a starting point that we'll end up getting to in that workshop is to set up an album factory, where it'll be the album factory that'll be responsible for going and getting the albums. And the controller itself will be responsible for sort of gluing together the whatever data is going to be coming back from the album factory to the view. And again, the way that the controllers do this in Angular is with scope. So here's, sort of a quote in terms of when you're writing code, right? You want to make sure that you're going to be writing code that's going to be maintainable. Because, one of the worst things that you can do, especially if you're on a development team, is to write something where it just works, but that there's no way that it's going to be maintainable. You have a piece of code that's doing way too much, and if someone had to go in and modify it or reuse something, they would really have no way of doing that. So let's sort of think about how, if we're looking at an application, how we could end up either refactoring things or pull things out, even though they're in different sections, but where they share some commonality. So, let's say that we had on our application we had a settings page. So, in relation to a user could end up modifying their security settings. A user might also be able to go and modify their payment or their billing settings. And so you could sort of imagine that on these three different pages, the top one and these pages that are below it, they're all relying on what would be considered a user object. These are all things that are related to the user. So in one case, we could update a profile, we could end up updating a password, we could end up updating a billing address. And although if we set these things up as separate controllers and we ended up making HTTP calls from the controllers themselves, you could do that, but you'd really have no reusability for it. So that would end up being a little bit problematic, and we want to make it so that our code is going to be easily understood. So in all of these cases here, we're updating user information. If we have some kind of factory or some kind of user object that gives us the ability to do that, then all of these things can end up relying on the same object. And the nice thing about that is that we could end up maintaining it. So in other words, if the logic for updating a user, maybe the endpoint for the user ends up changing. Maybe there's some additional tokens that have to be sent for the user. There's only one spot that we have to worry about updating that. And that's really going to make our code a lot more maintainable. One thing that ends up happening here is that if someone came along and said, hey, look, here's another feature that we want to add that pertains to the user, you could just really focus on the controller itself. And again, you could, basically leverage what you've written in terms of, interacting with the back end with some user factory. And it's a lot less work. And basically, you have the ability to extend the code. And if the code is extendable, it's going to, be another opportunity to, have more work where, you can, you're not in a position where your code base is going to end up getting very stale. Because again, it's broken up into different parts. You could always end up getting rid of a certain part. But again, the fact that things are modular are going to make the code much more extendable. So this is, really where we have this modular pattern. So that's just sort of a general pattern. But the next thing that we're going to talk about is how Angular ends up accomplishing this through what are called Angular factories. Okay, so Angular factories are something that you'll end up using all the time. They're one of the nice things about them is that obviously you're going to end up getting reusability. That's the whole purpose of the factory. The other thing is that they're also fairly easy to test, which is nice. So when we start looking at how to test out Angular applications, these would sort of be the equivalent. If you remember on the server side when we ended up writing model tests, they were sort of isolated. This would fall more in line with writing a model test than something like a routing test, where there's a little bit more work that you have to do in order for you to get sort of meaningful results with your tests. So this is what a factory looks like. So assuming that we have an Angular application, meaning we have, our app has been defined with Angular module, we've named it. Again, since we're creating it, we would have passed that second parameter, which would have been dependencies. But assuming that we have this Angular application, not only can we create controllers, but we can create factories. And the way that this works, this is actually a very, very important distinction that you're going to have to make between controllers and factories. Factories only get created once. They're singletons. And what will end up happening in this case, the way that this would end up reading is that when someone ends up using this factory, okay, we don't manually end up creating the factories. We're going to use something called dependency injection. But when someone asks for math tools, what's going to happen is that it's going to end up calling this function and returning the tools. And it's only going to call this function one time, right? And now this is something that you've seen before. You've seen it with module exports, where if we did a console.log in a file that we were requiring, we would only see that console log, one time. Again, what ends up happening from a node perspective is that when you end up requiring something, it sees, hey, look, have I used it before? If it's used it before, it returns what it ended up getting the last time it ended up using it. It's the same thing that you have with factories. That's an important distinction, because if this was app controller and we had some controller, first of all, we wouldn't end up returning anything. It would look a little bit different. We'd probably be injecting the scope. But that function that we assigned as a second parameter would end up getting called every time we created a new controller. For the app.factory, if we put a console.log above this var tools, right, you would only see that called at most one time. And it wouldn't even be called one time if, in fact, no other part of the application ended up requesting the math tools. So you have the idea of providing this factory, which we're doing on the top, and on the bottom, we're using this factory. So like I mentioned before, if this is a controller in our application, let's assume that the controller is being instantiated somewhere. We have a name for our controller, and we would end up creating that controller with the ng controller module. Here we're injecting the scope, and we're also injecting math tools. So math tools is a factory. From what we could see here, the only thing that math tools can do is it can format a percentage. So when we end up asking for math tools, we get this object back, and if we end up using math tools has the ability to format a percentage. So, the reason why you end up doing this is that what you're really trying to do is you're trying to gain, pardon the pun, but control over your code, in the sense that you don't want to end up repeating yourself. Again, if you have 5 different parts of your application which are making a call to the back end, you don't want to have to write that in every single controller. You want to just be able to do it once, because what will end up happening is that if you have duplicated code, invariably what happens is that, oh, wait a second, I really have to send something else to the back end to get this information, and you find you're sort of just chasing yourself. So you're able to dry yourself out here by not repeating yourself. And you're also able to basically say, hey, look, here's this factory. Don't worry about how I'm formatting percentages. Understand that I'm going to do it correctly, right? It's a factory that's probably been tested out. And just use it. You'll end up using it as a black box. So the same way that we end up using other factories that we might not even have been aware were our factories, things like the $ HTTP is a factory. So we're using factories already, even if we don't realize it. We're not totally aware behind the scenes about how $ HTTP works. We know we can post with it. We know we can put with it. We know we can get with it. But how it's working behind the scenes is not terribly important, right? It's this sort of a black box implementation. And this gives us a degree of maintainability. It also gives us clarity in the code for a couple of different reasons. I mean, in the sense that you could look at a controller and you could say, all right, well, here's this album factory that's going to be, populating my albums, right? You don't have to be concerned about how it's going about populating those albums, what endpoints is actually calling. So you can sort of focus, if you're working on the controller and you're using this factory, you could focus on what the controller is doing, as opposed to things that the controller is not doing, but that the factory is doing. And one of the most important things that I mentioned before was the idea that you get this degree of testability. Again, factories are very easy to instantiate. And these factories, the fact is that the factories are helpful in terms of the fact of they're very easy to get from within our Angular application, but they're also very easy to create when we're testing out our application as well. So that's something that's definitely going to come in handy. So we mentioned dependency injection. So when we talk about dependency injection, if we end up having a controller, we name the controller, our second function is going to give us some functionality. So how do we instantiate a controller? And again, very important point is that every time we would end up using this myCoolControl on our page, this function would end up getting instantiated. So if, let's say that we had this controller Microsoft stock, and we had this factory math tools, again, dependency injection would ensure that we can end up using this factory within our controller. And Angular is going to be very, very clear to you that it doesn't know what you're trying to inject by giving you an error message. And if you didn't define a factory for math tools, it'll throw an exception. It'll say, hey, look, you're telling me that I should inject these objects, but I don't know what this object is. It knows what the scope is. It knows what the $ HTTP is, and there's a bunch of other built-in factories. But again, if you didn't define the math tools, you would end up getting an exception. So, you could also make the case of saying, hey, look, why do I really need a factory? Can't I just, if I have some business logic that's sitting around, can I end up just creating a plain old JavaScript object and, can I just include it? And you could. Nothing would be, I shouldn't say nothing should be wrong with it because there's better ways to do it. And the point is that if you did create some object that you ended up defining in some JavaScript file and you ended up, including that in your index.html file, sure, you could end up using it. You wouldn't necessarily have to inject it here. But the problem with that is that, you're basically just polluting your global namespace. Where here, you've got this maintainability. Someone can go and look at your application and say, hey, look, you know what? I know that math tools is defined somewhere, right? I know it's defined somewhere, and they could go and find out where it's defined. And if they want to dig into the functionality or add to the functionality, they could always do it. So we could think about having a module that we created. Again, you've seen this before, but worth repeating. Here's this variable app. We're creating an Angular module. We know we're creating it because that second parameter has brackets. If we had dependencies, those brackets would be inside there, and we'll end up putting some dependencies in there at some point. We could also end up creating a factory. So we have this factory. Again, this factory is related to our module, and we know that because we're defining it with this app variable. We could then specify, hey, look, we want to create another factory. And this factory is going to be called restaurants. And what this says right off the bat is that these two factories can be injected in other controllers or in other modules. And maybe we've got another factory for hotels, right? This sort of brings you back to the trip planner application. And if we had this, if you ended up having a controller, right, there would be nothing that would prevent you from injecting the math tools, right? It's going to be able to go and find it because, it's been registered within this module. On the same token, if you had a restaurant list controller, the restaurant list controller might want to end up using this restaurants factory. And in fact, you could even use a factory within another factory. Maybe you want to create a factory called favorite restaurants. And maybe this will only end up, returning some of the restaurants to you. So maybe there's some criteria which will end up determining what your favorite restaurant is. So there's nothing that is wrong with, and there's nothing that prevents you from having factories that end up referencing other factories. The one thing that's important here is that when we end up looking at the dependency injection, controllers don't end up getting injected, right? Controllers end up using factories, right? The factories don't end up using the controllers. Again, you could sort of think about the factories as being one level up from the controllers. So again, we have this idea of being able to inject things in here. In our case, whatever module this controller is in, as long as it your Angular knows how to find math tools, or on the bottom knows how to find restaurants, it's going to end up being in good shape. And again, we can think about this second function as an injectable function. And like I said, Angular will be clear as could be if it doesn't understand what you're trying to inject, and it'll end up throwing an exception at you. So we have looked at any number of factories. We ended up looking at HTTP. We ended up looking at the scope. There's also a filter factory, which we'll end up using that allow us to create custom filters that we could use. There's a location factory, which can allow us to change the URL of the page that we're looking at, or find out the URL of the page that we're looking at. So there's any number of built-in factories that we can end up using. What I want to do now is move on to another video where we'll actually go in and we'll end up just within the context of JSBin, we'll end up creating a little application which will show us the connection between factories and controllers, and should help you get started with the workshop.